Welcome to Challenging Climate, a podcast where we discuss the science, technology, and politics of climate change. I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist.
And I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy expert. Each episode, we bring on a guest with a unique perspective and deep expertise on climate change and put challenging questions to them.
In this episode, we spoke with environmental author Emma Marris. Emma writes about environmental issues in a number of venues and is the author of 2 books about our relationship to the natural world and the creatures within it: Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, and Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World.
In addition to being an excellent writer and an engaging speaker, I followed Emma's work off and on over the last decade, where I have appreciated how she has confronted difficult questions, if not sacred cows, in the area of conservation biology and wilderness management. And I think she's helped open up a space where we are able to talk more clearly about what we can do, what we should do, and what we have done as stewards of the planet. The answers are not clear. There's plenty of room to disagree, but I believe that Emma has made a valuable contribution to this challenging topic.
Yeah, and personally, I read Rambunctious Garden. I was really impressed with that book. I think in some sense it's quite formative to how I look at the natural world and our relationship to it. We can't get away from the fact that we're having an influence on the planet. The question is then, what are the responsibilities that come with that influence? How should we be shaping our interaction with the natural world to leave space for the wildness, the rambunctiousness of our earthly garden? And it was interesting to get into her new book where she touches more on our relationship to individual creatures and responsibilities to them. So really interesting conversation, great to sort of hear her, and really nice to meet her. It was a fun time.
I'm going to build on what you said, take it just one step further. One thing that I find most interesting about her writing and included in our conversation here is she makes the point that I suspect is counterintuitive to people who might disagree with her. And that is that as our capacity to influence the earth and ecosystems and species have grown, it must be acknowledged not only that we have been doing that for longer than we believe, but it is a responsibility that must be embraced, perhaps reluctantly, but our responsibility actually increases as we recognize that we've exhibited such power. So we bring you Emma Marris.
Emma Marris, welcome to Challenging Climate.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we like to start off by asking our guests a bit about their background. So how is it you came to be an environmental author and columnist?
So I got a master's degree in science writing when I decided that I wanted to be involved with the sciences, but I didn't necessarily want to be a sort of tenure track academic type. I thought it would be interesting to write about science. And in the beginning, that wasn't necessarily environmental science. Particularly, I was interested in the sciences pretty broadly. And then I got a position at the journal Nature as a reporter, reporting on, well, in particular, I was reporting on the stuff that was not already being covered by the other 2 reporters who were already hired in the DC office. Jeff Brumfield, who's now on NPR in the States, covers the physical sciences, and Erica Check, who's now in California as a teacher, was doing biomedicine. So that meant I was the mop-up crew, and I covered everything else. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but one of the things that I covered was environmental science and ecology, and I really fell in love with it and some of the philosophical questions that were kind of buried in that science. And that's what really kicked off the kind of writing that ended up getting turned into my books.
Let's talk a bit about your book, Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, which came out 10 years ago now. And it was a book that really struck me. Its message about a pragmatic approach to wilderness and conservation. Emma, could you briefly summarize what you were trying to convey with Rambunctious Garden?
Yeah, so at the time when I wrote that, I was still working Nature as a feature writer and a news writer. And what I was really hoping to do was capture a kind of movement that I saw beginning to happen in conservation, away from using the past as both the sort of only reference point and as the goal, and towards something a little more pluralistic, a little more untethered from the past. And I think that movement was really sort of just gaining a little bit of steam at the time. The book came out in 2011. I mean, the roots of it go back pretty far. You could look as far back as the 90s when people in the environmental humanities like Bill Cronin were questioning the wilderness idea. You could also look at the sort of way that people were actually doing conservation practice on the ground, which has always been a case study in compromises and pragmatism, and not so much a slavish devotion to 1491 or whatever year you want to pick. But sort of conceptually, and from the point of view of the general public, more specifically, I think that it was pretty new to start thinking about the ways in which, for example, North America wasn't virgin wilderness when Christopher Columbus stepped off the boat. And these were conversations that I thought would be important to take out of academia and out of the field and present more broadly to the general public. So that's what Rambunctious Garden was about. And it was really inspired by both a new appreciation for pre-colonial land changes, landscape changes that came out of research that Western scientists were finally learning about indigenous land management and going all the way back to the Pleistocene and even extinctions that were happening back then. And then the other strand of it was really me taking a look at invasion biology and the sort of campaign against invasive species that was going on in many countries at the time and still is, and was eating up a lot of resources that I felt could have been used better elsewhere. So that's how Rambunctious came to be. And I'll note that I really saw myself back then as a straight up reporter. And I thought of this as a straight up reporting job, like, here's some interesting new trends in conservation. But all of my readers could tell that I was very sympathetic to these new trends and that I was quite excited by them. And so they saw it more potentially as a sort of a manifesto or an opinion piece than I necessarily intended it to be. And in some ways, I've just sort of decided in my career to lean into that a little bit. And you'll see that my second piece is actually much more nakedly opinionated than the first one.
And just as a brief note of self or cross promotion, I think that Elizabeth Colbert's book, Under a White Sky, sort of builds on these ideas and thinking carefully, more through specifically the technological lens, but thinking about what we're trying to do with how we as humans conserve and manage nature. The reason I bring her up is we had her on the show about a year ago, episode 6 or so, for listeners who may be interested. Key passage in the book, I think that these two sentences that struck me as really capturing the essence of the book is that, quote, "We are already running the whole earth, whether we admit it or not. To run it consciously and effectively, we must admit our role and even embrace it. We must temper our romantic notion of untrammeled wilderness and find room next to it for the more nuanced notion of a global, half-wild, rambunctious garden tended by us." Is there wilderness? What is wilderness? Does it exist in this view of nature that you put forth in the book?
Yeah, no, I think that wilderness, is a tricky word. A lot of these words are tricky. Nature is tricky. Wild is tricky. Wilderness, if you're defining it as being some place that is totally uninfluenced by humans, then no, I don't think it exists, because every place is now influenced by climate change, right? I mean, this was Bill McKibben's insight as early as 1989 in his book, The End of Nature. His thesis there was that if you're defining nature as something that's uninfluenced by humanity, then there's no nature left. So I think wilderness, in the sort of most strict, purest sense, defined as the absence of human fingerprints, probably doesn't exist. And that sounds really tragic. And I think I found it to be quite tragic for a long time. And I really wrestled with that. But I think that there are some more subtle versions of wilderness that are still very much alive and kicking. And those include places that are largely autonomous on a day-to-day basis, right? That humans aren't managing them intentionally. So one thing that I've started to realize that we need to peel apart is influence and intention. Everything has been influenced by people. Not everything is being intentionally managed by people. So I don't know what you want to call those areas that aren't being intentionally managed by people, that are essentially left to their own devices, but within a larger planetary humanization. You could call them wildernesses. And I have, depending on who I'm writing, what audience I'm writing for, what the context is. I think that they instantiate that autonomy, that kind of non-domesticated, those values that we want to see in the world.
Do you think that this concept of wilderness, which the way you describe it, I see it as a spectrum and not a binary, and it's also more of borrow a cliche, more of a journey than a destination. It can be a type of a guidepost, but you're never there. Would you agree with that?
I mean, a guidepost suggests that it is always the goal. I mean, I think the one thing to keep in mind is we're going to have different goals for different places, different parts of the world. So in some parts of the world, that kind of wildness or autonomy is not going to be a goal because we're trying to do something else there. Maybe we're just trying to grow food or have a town. but maybe we're trying to save particular species, and that actually might require a bit of ongoing intervention to keep those species going. So then in that case, autonomy wouldn't necessarily be the goal. But I do share your thought there that there should be at least some places where we're not messing around all the time and we're not managing all the time and we're not directing the ecosystem. I think we would be fools not to do that, partly because of our own sort of moral, spiritual development. The whole world shouldn't be our plaything. But I also think that we can learn a ton from places that we're not actively managing, because other species will come up with solutions to problems that we never would have thought of.
Your book listed a few problems or challenges, at the very least, to using wilderness or purity as a guide for management. Could you touch on a few of those?
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of problems with trying to get back to some kind of pure state. So one of them is that it's sort of nonsensical, right? Like ecosystems are super dynamic through space and time. Even before the human species existed, they were changing constantly as the climate changed for other reasons, as the continents moved around. And then, of course, as all the other components in the ecosystem evolved, then the other components would evolve in response to this ongoing kind of adaptive ballet. I mean, and honestly, that's part of the reason that we like, what we call nature so much, right? Is that it's this incredibly complicated, adaptive, dynamic thing. It's not just a little list of species that were there on some day, magical day, that we need to recreate. So that's one reason that I don't think it's good, is it doesn't really make any sense. There was no sort of correct day for every ecosystem that we need to get back to that has any kind of scientific primacy over any other day or any other state. And in the northern hemisphere, in the temperate zone, a lot of places were just wiped clean by glaciers repeatedly over the millennia. And then every time the glaciers rolled back, you get a slightly different ecosystem kind of rolling up the continent. Which one of those is the right one? There's no kind of scientific answer to that question. Another one that's really important is that a lot of this sort of our definitions to this day of, they've given them new names. We no longer tend to call them historical baselines. We'll call them something like the natural range of variability or the historical range of variation or the intactness or health. There's lots of synonyms that have been developed that sound very scientific, but they're still almost all pegged to the time of colonization, which means we're making this really artificial and troubling distinction between the ways that white people have changed landscapes and the way that indigenous people have changed landscapes. And we're saying that some of them are quote unquote natural and some of them aren't. That doesn't make any sense. People are people, either you're going to decide that all people are unnatural blights on the system, or you're going to decide, that there are potential ways in which humans can interact well with nature and that you have to judge things by their outcomes, not based on just has a human touched this. So those are some of the reasons. And then another reason is that you're not going to be able to achieve it, right? Like the climate is changing. Things are moving. You're not going to be able to recreate 1850 or 1770 or 1500 like they want to do in the UK. Like these are not possible, achievable goals anymore. And if we try, we're going to be pouring money into trying to create a Disneyland version of nature the way that we think it ought to be.
You mentioned white people and indigenous people in your answer there, and a moment ago you spoke of 1491. Is there something about this understanding of wilderness that dominates the conservation movement that is particularly American, or at least particularly North American? This idea of there was something pristine before we, whoever we may be, or from some people, they came here.
Yeah, absolutely. This sort of kind of Edenic narrative that talks about, people showing up and then ruining everything, it really did develop most strongly in North American environmentalism. And to this day, that sort of North American and then also Australian, right, which has a pretty similar colonial history, and Canadian as well. They have an outsized influence globally on sort of how we think about conservation. For example, I will give you a very pertinent example, which is the latest Montreal Kunming biodiversity goals that were just announced, a new Convention on Biological Diversity agreement that just came out. And that agreement was this big, long, complicated negotiation by people from all over the world. And the concept here is that all the countries of the world that sign on to this, which sign on to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the majority of them, will embrace these goals. And the first goal is that the quote unquote integrity of ecosystems be maintained or enhanced, some kind of language like that. And if you're wondering what does that mean, the integrity of the ecosystem, and you look into the documents that they have buried on their website, which define it, they're defining it as the natural range of variation. And then the citation they give for that is a paper with about 15 authors, and every single one of the authors is from Canada, the United States, or Australia, and they're all basing the natural range of variation on the 200 years before their colonization event. So, I think that in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot more kind of thinking and talking about what are we conserving for? What are our goals? There's been in philosophical circles, environmental humanities circles. The success, for example, of Robin Wall Kimmerer's breeding sweetgrass has brought to the masses the notion that there might be a way for humans to interact with non-humans in a way that isn't destructive, which is an incredibly exciting development. But in the policy, it's still, we got to get back to Eden, and Eden is defined as the moment of colonization. And it's very much, I think, lasting legacy of North American thinking on conservation as a whole.
So Jesse and myself live in some of the most heavily managed landscapes on the planet. I'm in the southeast of England and he's in the Netherlands. What does sort of mainstream or old-fashioned conservation have to say about such landscapes?
So this is something I've been exploring a lot in my year here over on this side of the Atlantic. And, I find it really interesting because on the one hand, the way that people here, and by here, I mean sort of Europe and UK and that whole thing, think is much different because exactly as you said, these landscapes have been so heavily modified for so long. Although, interestingly, I'm sure you guys have seen this book, which is The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole, which is in every single bookstore in London right now. And then in Ireland, there's a similar book by a fellow who's been doing restoration there. And there's an interesting enthusiasm for looking into sort of deeper time, ecological history of the UK that I think is quite fascinating. And I'll be following that. And that comes on the heels of the sort of rise in popularity of European rewilding in places like the Netherlands, which is much more of a grasslands megafauna-based enthusiasm for bringing a kind of a return to older ecosystem processes. And yet, I don't think that anybody who's doing work in the UK or in continental Europe thinks it's achievable to get back to, let's say 1500. I think that's 1500 or 1600. I hear a lot in the UK in particular when people are talking about what counts as a native bird or something. But at the same time, some of these North American notions have kind of bled into the sort of way that people think over here. For example, I was just in Denmark and I gave a talk where I criticized this notion of ecosystem integrity. And then somebody pointed out that, in fact, their national level conservation plan has the word integrity in it like 25 times because they've just adopted this language and this sort of vague concept from the academics of North America. So I think there's a lot of weirdness here where you sometimes have people who are not necessarily thinking about trying to go back in time, but they're still thinking about what is an intact or a reference state in this weird way. I'm still exploring it. I'm still trying to figure out what everyone's trying to do over here. Obviously, the alternative to all of these reference states and all of this going back in time is simply to try to protect biodiversity, which is actually a lot simpler sometimes. I mean, basically, it takes away this whole hang up about where everything is. So if things are moving around because it's heating up or they're forming new ecological relationships, this is no longer seen necessarily as degradation. It could be seen as adaptation. It could be seen very positively. It depends on what those interactions are doing. If the new interaction is that some introduced predator is eating all the native animals and they're about to go extinct, then that's one thing. But if the new interaction is, a native butterfly is laying its eggs on an introduced plant that's blooming at the right time, that might be a really positive development.
Building off of what you said about European view of wilderness, I'm in the Netherlands where the Oostvaarderplassen has always struck me as a fascinating story. You mentioned this a bit in Rambunctious Garden, and it has had a story since then. Can you share a little bit with our listeners about how this so-called new wilderness came to be?
Right. So it's been a while now since my visit to the Oostvaarderplassen with Franz Vera. And I can tell you exactly when it was because I was pregnant with my first kid and she's 13 now. So that was a while ago. But basically the concept here was to take some land that essentially been reclaimed from the sea, like a lot of places in the Netherlands, and let it kind of go wild, but see what would come of it if the ecosystem was structured by the presence of a significant number of grazers, sort of red deer and cattle playing the role of the extinct auroch, and wild horses, heritage breeds of horses playing the role of wild horses. And so it created this incredible grassland landscape that also had little pockets of trees. And it was essentially like a test for Franz Werf's theories about the ecological development of Europe in sort of early, thousands of years ago.
What struck me is that not only is this a new wilderness, is the name of a documentary that was made about it, but the land is new. It wasn't just
Right.
reclaimed from the sea. That happened after World War II in the early 1960s, as part of the so-called South Sea was gradually reclaimed. And it's, by any traditional definition, it can't be a wilderness. Did you hear about the protests that happened there?
Yes, I did hear about that. You're talking about the sort of animal welfare concerns.
Right. What was as a rambunctious gardener, what was your reaction to this?
Well, I think it was inevitable in a way, because as I explore in my more recent book, we have very different moral rules for how we treat wild animals than how we treat domestic animals. And using animals, species that we've domesticated or that we're used to seeing in domestic contexts, like cattle and horses, using them as proxies for wild animals and allowing them to sort of go wild and not receive regular veterinary care, not be stabled, not be sort of fed, that freaks people out. And when they die of starvation, that seems like just rank animal cruelty, because we have different rules for how you treat a wild deer from how you treat a domestic horse that somebody owns. So by sort of blurring those categories together, this sort of, it was inevitable that people are going to be upset. Those who see them as wild animals think that their circumstances are unnatural because they have no natural predators and because sometimes shot when they're in a bad way. And those who see them as domestic animals think that their circumstances are appalling because they are starving to death on a regular basis.
Well, I think that's a good point to transition over to your new book. Could you outline the main arguments of Wild Souls?
In Rambunctious Garden, I really took a look at this concept of wilderness and whether or not it holds up and is helpful to us. In this newer book, I took a look at this sort of concept of the wild animal. Again, we have changed the whole planet. We've heated it up, for one thing. And so all animals on the planet are living in conditions that have been kind of set by us. And many, many wild animals interact with the human world on pretty much a daily basis. They have to deal with roads, they have to deal with noise pollution, plastic pollution, they have to deal with agricultural landscapes, they're dealing with other species that we have moved. They're living in a humanized world. And so to me, this really complicated this sort of let nature take its course notion, this sort of simplistic idea that the only ethical obligations that we have to wild animals is to leave them alone. So the sort of classic paradigm example here might be the polar bear starving because it can't hunt because there's no sea ice. Why is there no sea ice? Because of climate change. So do we owe that polar bear, not the species, but that individual polar bear, do we owe that polar bear anything because we are the cause of its problems? So that was the kickoff point for Wild Souls. But I do talk about lots of different kinds of relationships that humans have with wild animals, including zoos and hunting and conservation interactions. I'll get quite a few chapters about things like breeding in captivity, translocations, and conservation killing, which I think is a really difficult tension between our desire to protect biodiversity and our desire not to kill animals for no good reason.
Well, let's get straight into that one then. How does conservation sometimes come into conflict with the fate of individual creatures?
So I'm really interested in islands because the ecological problems there are often quite intense. And in a lot of cases, islands have a problem of introduced predators. So it's a sort of almost a syndrome, right? You'll have an island and a lot of the animal species on this island might have over time lost some of their defenses or some of their maneuverability. On New Zealand, you have a lot of flightless birds. In Australia, you have a lot of little cute marsupials that aren't very particularly good at noticing that there's a predator about to pounce on them. They have kind of become easy picking, so to speak. And then in our globalized world, we humans bring to those islands species like rats and cats and foxes, like medium-sized and small predators that are extremely smart and extremely good at their jobs. And that is a recipe for a conservation crisis. But the main tool that we have to try to help those native species is to kill those predators, to kill those rats, kill those mice, kill those cats, kill those foxes. And so as a result, all around the world, especially on islands, conservationists kill a lot of animals. And I was particularly sort of surprised to find out that although many of them are shot or trapped, a lot of them are poisoned. And because these are smart predators, the poison that's most effective is one that has a delayed action. Because if it makes you feel lousy when you first eat it, you'll probably never eat it again. And so instead, these are poisons that kill you slowly on purpose. You bleed out of all of your orifices and you slowly die. Unfortunately, that's the way that conservation has determined is the best way to save these species, but it's not pretty, is it?
Oh, that's pretty grisly. I guess another thing that sort of struck me in the opening section of the book was the question of just how wild some of the wild creatures that are somewhat near to us are. I live in, I said, South England, and Jesse's in Netherlands, and we don't have bears and wolves and lions and things, but you do over in America. How wild are these wild predators?
Yeah, this was another reason that I got interested in sort of individual wild animals, is I was covering wolves a lot in Oregon where I was living. And it was at the moment of wolf reintroduction for Oregon where there were fewer than 100 wolves, and a lot of them had radio collars on. And so scientists knew a lot about these individual animals. They had given them numbers. They knew their sort of personalities, which ones were more likely to sort of run afoul of a local rancher and which ones were more cagey and kind of stuck to elk. I even wrote a piece for Outside Magazine that didn't end up in the book, where I charted the 7-year relationship between a particular wildlife manager working for the state of Oregon and one wolf that he consistently was interacting with, and ended up putting 5 separate radio collars on. So, when I was doing the research for that story, I remember going into the offices there and I sort of said, well, give me a sense of where all the wolves are in Oregon. And I thought answers would be somewhat vague, like, oh, well, we think there's a pack over here, or there's some have been spotted over here. But instead, they pulled up this like GPS tracker with every pack in Oregon live reporting their GPS coordinates to the HQ. Like they knew where they all were because at that moment, they had a collar on at least one animal from every pack in the state. And I was like, if they wanted to, they could wipe every wolf in Oregon in like 2 weeks. It didn't feel like these animals were totally autonomous. It felt like they were kind of like a glorified pet that we were sharing throughout the whole state. Not that the wolves knew that, mind you, but it didn't feel like they were massively wild, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you also had some points that I thought were interesting about when these wild animals break our rules, they face consequences.
Right. So in the case of the wolves, the agricultural community had sort of negotiated with the conservation community, and the result was essentially this sort of guidelines for when you could shoot a wolf and when the state would shoot a wolf. And, sort of stuff like if the animal predates on livestock with a certain number of times, so within a certain time framework, then the state will control it. So we allowed them to be on the landscape, but only if they behaved themselves with a certain amount of decorum. We weren't willing to accept their full range of behaviors. There were limits. And if they crossed those limits, we would kill them. And that didn't seem totally wild to me either. Contrast that, for example, with, as I do in the book, with the sort of a native ground squirrel. Probably thousands, hundreds of thousands of these guys all over Oregon. Nobody knows their names. Nobody's got radio collars on them. Nobody knows what they're doing. Okay. They're totally on their own devices. In some ways, they feel a lot wilder. And if we tried to kill them, just like with the rats in New York City, we have tried to kill them over and over again, and we can't. It seems like they have control over the rats in New York City than we do over the wolves in Oregon.
So if we're starting to think about the responsibilities that we have, the moral responsibilities that we have to tame animals, pets, and degrees of wild animals that we have influence over, I guess we've got to start thinking about, do those responsibilities differ depending on the kind of animal? So, I guess now I'll start off a little lighthearted. Was Kurt Cobain right? Is it okay to eat fish because they don't have any feelings?
Well, no, I don't know if it's okay to eat fish or not. You're going to have to examine your own conscience. But it is, in fact, the case that fish do have feelings. There's a whole book on this written by a guy named Jonathan Balcone, which I recommend, that really changed the way I think about fish. And it is harder for us to understand their emotional range and their cognitive capabilities because we can't interact directly with them because they live in the water and we live on the land. And every time we pull them out of their medium in order to catch them and eat them, they're in extreme distress. And so it's not like we can gaze into each other's eyes and develop rapport. One thing he points out in the book is they don't blink. They don't have eyelids. And so their eyes are always open. And so we interpret them as being kind of vacant. So that was really interesting for me to read. I was doing a lot of research on different animal capabilities. One thing that's definitely true is that there isn't any kind of relationship between animals' sort of cognitive abilities and emotional abilities and how we categorize and treat them. Like, we have farm animals that we eat. We have pet animals that we share our lives with and will spend thousands of dollars to buy medical care for. We have pest animals that we'll call the pest guy to come in and trap and kill. And then we have beautiful wild animals that we'll pay a lot of money to go and photograph and see in nature. And they'll all have very similar levels of cognitive abilities and very similar social organization and very similar abilities to feel pleasure and pain. But we treat them radically differently.
So, what are some of the moral principles or ideas that people have brought to bear on this? How do different people or how do different theories say that we should treat these animals or these different types of animals?
Well, when I was investigating this, I started with environmental ethics because I'm an environmental reporter, and my previous work's mostly been thinking about biodiversity. And there, if you look back at the sort of classic Michael Soule paper about conservation biology from the 1980s, he very explicitly says that it is not concerned with individuals and that animal suffering may be regrettable, but it's basically not the concern of conservation, which is just about saving populations and species and not about individuals. So that's pretty clear that conservation ethics doesn't really have room in it to consider individual animals. So then I turned to sort of looking at animal ethics theories. And I'd say that there's sort of maybe three broad approaches. The first one would be a utilitarian approach, which is all about thinking about everything in the world that can feel pleasure and feel pain and trying to run the world so that there's the most pleasure possible and the least pain possible. The kind of biggest name that is associated with this is Peter Singer. And he wrote Animal Liberation in the 1970s. That changed a lot of people's minds, turned a lot of people into vegetarians. It was very influential. It was really based on this idea that causing pain is wrong. Then there's animal rights approaches, which are not so much based on pleasure and pain, but just based on this notion that animals are sort of like people in that they have their inherent worth and dignity and they're sentient creatures, and you shouldn't just use them as a means to an end. If any of your listeners are familiar with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, it's basically like animal Kantianism. And then the third big category would be sort of relational theories that are often written about by people who might be classified as sort of ecofeminists or different schools of theory that talk a lot about the relationships between humans and individual animals and how those create kinds of obligations and reciprocal relationships that go beyond just sort of easy answers. So I dove into all of these. I was hoping to be totally convinced by one of them to the exclusion of the others, but my takeaway was that all three of them have elements that are useful to make decisions, but that any one of these theories in isolation doesn't necessarily cover you. You kind of need more than one approach in order to feel your way through dilemmas. But then that means that sometimes the approaches might conflict and you might have to make a judgment call, which isn't always the best feeling.
So did you find after writing this book, your views had changed? It sounds like you've reached a fairly moderate or multifaceted view. Did your perspective change in any other ways?
I mean, it definitely, as I went, there were things that I changed my mind about. And for example, decided to write a chapter about zoos just because I felt like I should cover the bases of the major ways that most people interact with wild animals. And for many of us who are not out on a remote Pacific island shooting foxes to try to save native species, for many of us, that might be going to a zoo. So I thought I would look into that, and I went into that with a pretty open mind, and I came out thinking that zoos are probably not great. Let's be more specific, that breeding animals for display in zoos is probably not really a defensible practice. Don't necessarily have any problem with taking care of animals that can't be in the wild or with doing conservation breeding for animal populations that might eventually get let out. I think you could even justify it for multi-generational breeding programs where some of these generations are going to stay in captivity. But to just breed elephants or tigers or bears just for us to look at forever and ever and never let them out, I don't think we can defend that. So I kind of changed my mind on zoos. There are still things that, when it comes to conservation killing, for example, I cannot say, here's what I think you should think, because I think that the values of biodiversity and ecosystem protection are really important. I also think that not killing and causing pain are things that we should try to do where we can. So when is it acceptable to kill for conservation? It's so case by case. And it's going to depend on every person's individual values and where they put their finger on the scale about what's more important to them, biodiversity, individual animal suffering, how are they set out. Can't give you a magical algorithm to solve some of these ethical conundrums. And I wanted to, I really wanted to be able to solve these problems. That's the kind of person I am. I like to be like, all right, I've sorted that one out. But there's too many valuable things, and not all of them can be measured against each other. You can't easily trade them off against each other. And so you have to make difficult decisions.
Shifting gears a bit to the problem that we sometimes seek to solve, or at least address, Pete and I, is the question of climate change. Although these two books we're discussing are about the management of land and wilderness and how we relate to animals, I'm curious if you have drawn lessons from your work in this area for how we should respond to climate change, how we could respond to climate change.
Yeah, for me, I think the biggest lesson is almost psychological, I would say. And that is when I went through the sort of mental journey of realizing that these Edenic wildernesses were not someplace, we couldn't return to these paths, and that it didn't really make any sense to try to do that. At first, that felt really sad. And then I realized that it was okay, that we could still save the diversity of life. And the fact that it was going to reorganize itself spatially was actually a good thing, because that meant that it was adapting to a changing world. Now, with climate change, I see this all the time, which is that climate change is going to cause changes. And the tendency is to assume that all changes are negative because they are change. Yes, maybe we like to have something different for dinner once a week, but I think some level most humans really crave consistency, especially in sort of the ecosystems around us. We don't want to see new animals, plants. What is this? It's unnerving. So I think that what it's really taught me is that when we see a change, we really have to take a breath before we decide that this change is bad. Because what it might be is that this change is either people or other species solving problems that have been presented by climate change. So whether that's people migrating from place to place on the planet, people changing what crops they grow, or whether it's other species moving, birds migrating in different places, just because things are changing doesn't mean that those changes are bad. Those changes might represent the solutions unfolding. And that can be really tricky to wrap your brain around. But it's really helped me with this very difficult problem that we all face, which is how to be happy in a world that has warmed up and is going to keep warming up.
Most of our listeners are probably familiar by now with the concept of the Anthropocene, the proposed epoch, geological epoch that we humans might be in which we are a leading influence on Earth systems. Do you believe that we're in an Anthropocene? And if so, when might this have begun?
So I'm glad you used the word influence there, because as I alluded to earlier, I think that a lot of the sort of debate over the Anthropocene has been a little more contentious than potentially it needs to be. And I think the reason for that contention is that there's been people talking about influence. Oh, yes, this means that humans are influencing everything. And then other people hearing and thinking that it means control, like intentional day-to-day management, right? And that also we need to differentiate the difference between acknowledging a state of affairs and condoning that state of affairs, right? So when people hear the Anthropocene, they think, this is such a hubristic, arrogant concept. It's basically saying we're just going to be gods and we're just going to run the whole planet for our own pleasure and just be like completely selfish. That doesn't sound good to me either. That sounds terrible. I totally understand why people are repulsed by that notion. I think the way that many of the people who use the term are sort of trying to use it is more of a marker of, hey, wow, our influence has been profound on this planet, and we're going to have to reckon with that. Some of this we meant to do, so a lot of this we did not mean to do, but here it is, and it's happening, and it's going to continue to happen. This may mean that we have more moral obligations to take care of and fix things than we did previously. And I think I do agree with that. I think if you looked back 100,000 years, would you say that the humans existing at that time had any kind of obligations to other species that they didn't directly interact with on a day-to-day basis? No, not necessarily. I would say that they were just fellow citizens of Earth. But because of our massive influence, I do think that we may now have more obligations to other species and to other individuals than we did. Now, how to discharge those obligations is a very complicated question, one that's going to no doubt keep me busy for the rest of my writing career. And I don't foresee us solving it definitively in any of our lifetimes. But I do think that insofar as we define the Anthropocene as a time in which humanity has to reckon with what it has done, then yeah, I think we're in the Anthropocene.
I'll wrap up with a quotation and a question. And it's another passage, another sentence from your book, Rambunctious Garden. It says, Rambunctious gardening is proactive and optimistic. It creates more and more nature as it goes, rather than just building walls around the nature we have left. What gives you optimism in the face of what appears to many to be a worsening environmental condition?
I actually have a lot of optimism. First of all, some of the worst possible climate outcomes look like they're less likely now than they were 10 years ago. Obviously, we can all wish that we were in a better position than we are now, but some of the most sort of apocalyptic outcomes no longer look like they're very likely. That's giving me hope. Another thing that gives me hope is just the massive numbers of people that care about this stuff. You know, when I tell people what I do for a living, they don't look puzzled or like this environmental issues are remote from their lives. They usually respond with interest or with anguish. And although I wish that we could find a way to move forward in a way that would allow us to feel like we were working for the greater good and not being so anguished, that anguish is itself to me an indication that people do care, you know, the world we live in and about the other species that we share the planet with. And I do see lots of little signs, from policy changes to just cultural differences, to suggest that people, by and large, do want us to fix this. Now, there's obviously really entrenched problems and power structures that make it really difficult. You know, if we could just do a global referendum, should we spend a lot of money to try to solve environmental problems? I'm sure it'd pass overwhelmingly. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But I think the fact that the popular will is there is always going to give me optimism, because then I don't think we necessarily need to change people's minds and get them to care. I think people do care.
Our guest today on Challenging Climate has been Emma Marris, columnist at The Atlantic and author most recently of Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. Emma, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
If you think the hours of listening pleasure that you've got from our podcast are worth a couple of minutes of your time, then slide over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and take a moment to give us a rating and review. This will really help us grow this podcast and reach new listeners. Thanks. Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.